So we are here today. This is the Society Podcast, where we kind of just want to talk about different issues that the members of our youth in our congregation kind of have, and the questions that they have, and the struggles that they're going through. And I think today's topic is peer pressure, and I think you have some stuff prepared on that.
Yeah, peer pressure is a big thing, especially in today's society, and even in young people. There is lots of peer pressure that goes around, but I think to understand peer pressure in its entirety, being able to break it down and identify what peer pressure is, knowing what it is, because I think a lot of times there's things that we think we don't struggle with, things that we think we don't do, but we just cannot identify that thing, and so we don't really know what it is. So really to just think about what peer pressure is. And to me, peer pressure would be anything that would come against any type of upbringing or background or truth or knowledge on a particular subject or thing or a person that you would have that would kind of rub against the grain of that thing, a group of people or a culture that would rub against the grain of this understanding that you have on a particular subject. And there are many instances in the Word where peer pressure was very obvious and a very real thing. In the garden, Adam and Eve, the serpent came and began to tell Eve, listen, God just doesn't want you to be like him. It's okay. You should do it. When the Israelites got set free from Egypt, they got delivered out of the hands of Pharaoh, and they're heading into the promised land, right? They're in the desert heading into the promised land. There was actually, the Bible uses this word, mixed multitude or rabble. And what that was people from different nations and different types of people that weren't necessarily Israelites that began to complain. And it says once they started to complain, the rest of the Israelites began to complain about what they were missing out on, what they didn't have. We should just go back to Egypt. And so it stemmed from those people there. Even the worship of the golden calf, right? Aaron, who had been put in position to take care of God's people while Moses was up on the mountain, right? They began to kind of pressure him into creating an idol. We need a God to worship. We need something to worship. And people love worship. We worship something, whether we believe it or not. And so from that and through that, Aaron created this golden calf out of just necklaces and all these different things that they had. But I think sometimes the mistake that we have in trying to identify peer pressure would be that we think that peer pressure has to be intentional, right? Obviously, there's intentional peer pressure like, Isaiah, you should drink this. This is the best thing you'll ever have. I promise you, it's amazing. Like, there's intentional peer pressure, but I think there's also sometimes unintentional peer pressure, right? When we encounter culture, there are just ways and things that are done a specific way, things that are listened to, things that are watched, and maybe people aren't constantly spilling and pouring into your ear. You should do this. You should walk like this. You should talk like this. But experiencing it all around, there's kind of an unspoken peer pressure. And we have to be able to identify that peer pressure, I think.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. How did you deal with peer pressure, throughout high school? I know that you got saved, later on in your life, and how did you manage with that?
Honestly, I grew up in a nice household, in a nice family. My mom, she was hardworking, she was diligent. She was a single mom. I kind of count her as a single parent for most of her life. My dad passed away a month before I was born, and my brother's dad, he just really wasn't a good guy. And from that moment on, there were guys that were kind of in and out, but not because my mom was, she was honestly looking for something that would be long-term, a commitment that would go beyond just a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship, but into marriage. And she just never found that, whether they abused her or whatever. But she was always diligent. She was working full-time, going to school part-time, working on getting her bachelor's and then her master's, and all, the whole time supporting us in whatever we did. So I grew up in a good family, and she taught me well how to respect people, how to, do my work and take school seriously, and even just being careful in decisions that I make. But you start to go to school and you start to experience some things, and you have friends and you make friends, and their lifestyle is different than yours. It's a new thing to you. It's fresh, it's different, and you're like, this is kind of interesting. I think I might be about this. And so that kind of took me down a path in a way, and it started off slow, but kind of got the best of me in the end. But obviously, getting saved and being delivered from a lot of things, I praise God for that. But it's important when dealing with peer pressure, whether it's intentional or not, to know your truth. And what I mean by that is to have a foundation, something that you believe, or understanding what it is that you want to live like, what it is that you want to portray in your life. Because pressure is going to push and push and push and push. There are very few things that can combat pressure. And really, some of the only things that can combat that is that if there's a leak, when you think about weak water pressure in your house, usually if there's a leak in some pipe somewhere, the pressure is kind of weak, it kind of sucks. But other than that, the only way to combat that pressure is that if there's pressure on the other side pushing back. And so it's important that we have something inside of us that can push back against things that are trying to change how we see, change how we feel, change what we know as true. We just went to the country of Nicaragua, and we had to fly on a plane, obviously. And a lot of us had water bottles on this plane. Some of us had water bottles that were full. Some of us had water bottles that were empty. And what's interesting is the water bottles that were either half empty or completely empty, the pressure from the cabin and being in the cabin and being so high in the sky squeezed the bottles and pressed them down. They began to not shrink, but just kind of not deteriorate, but just kind of squeeze in from the pressure, and the bottles that had water in them didn't. And so it's just interesting to look at that in a spiritual sense, in an emotional sense, when it's looking at the angle of peer pressure, right? The more water the bottle had, the better chances it had to keep its shape and to keep its form. And so it's important for us as people with some type of truth and some type of knowledge to have something in us that's going to push back against the pressure that's pushing down on us. Because if we don't, we'll conform to the pressure that's pushing on it. We'll conform to the weight of everything that's trying to move us in a specific direction. And that's why the Bible talks about in Romans not being conformed, but being transformed by the renewing of your mind, having something that you can hold to and cling to. There was an instance in the Bible where Paul corrected Peter, right? Because he was eating with Gentiles and he was loving on Gentiles. And if you don't know what that means, essentially non-Jewish people. He was hanging out with non-Jewish people, right? But all of a sudden, Jewish people show up on the scene, and he's not eating with those people anymore. He's just hanging out. He's got his people now. He's hanging out with the Jewish people. He's treating the Gentiles, the non-Jewish people, like he doesn't really know them, giving them the cold shoulder. And so he called him out on that and said, listen, why are you acting like that? All of a sudden, now the Jews come and you don't know them. The Jews come and you're not around them. And this is one of those kind of unintentional peer pressures, right? They don't say that the Jewish people began to roast Peter. They don't say that he began to coerce him, right? But that they showed up and he kind of just fell back into that, ignoring the Gentiles. And so it's important for us to have something that we can hold on to, something that is inside of us, right? A pressure that will push back against the outside. And I think it's important for people to be able to experience God for themselves, especially in a world that isn't wanting to be religious, in a world that doesn't want to serve and love Jesus and be filled, that you experience Jesus for yourself, right? Because I can tell you and tell you and tell you, and I can come and preach and teach, and your parents can teach and preach to you. But if you don't have that in yourself, the pressure on the outside will shape and mold you, just like the water bottle on the plane.
Well, that was awesome. Thank you. This has been the Society Podcast. Make sure you tune in next week with Pastor Levi, talking about more questions that are brought by our youth members in the congregation. I'm Isaiah.
I am Pastor Levi.
Thank you.
Thank you.